Welcome back to Through the Valley. This is your host, Bahar Alexander, executive coach, author, and speaker. Today feels different, not because we're beginning something new, but because we are returning to where we started. Do you remember our very first conversation about executive presence? That was episode 2. At the time, I introduced it as one of the defining capacities of exceptional leadership. We talked about gravitas, communication, confidence, credibility. We talked about influence. And while everything we explored was true, it wasn't the whole truth. The reality is, I couldn't begin with the whole truth because there was a journey we first had to take together, a journey through the valley. Over the past several episodes, we've explored integration. We've explored internal architecture. We've explored fear, decision-making, the nervous system, survival strategies. We explored intuition, inner authority, the invisible frictions that quietly consume a leader's energy. And most recently, the great differentiator, the transition from performing leadership to embodying leadership. Perhaps you noticed something. None of these episodes were called executive presence. And yet, every single one of them was about executive presence. You just didn't know it yet. Because I wanted you to experience the journey before revealing the destination. Today, we're coming full circle. Today, we are revisiting executive presence, not as a communication skill, not as body language, not as confidence, but as something far deeper. Because I no longer believe executive presence is something we develop. I believe it's something we uncover. And that distinction changes everything. When most people hear the words executive presence, they immediately think about external behaviors. Speaking with more confidence, slow down, improve your posture, maintain eye contact, control your body language, perhaps dress more professionally, project authority, communicate with conviction. None of these are bad pieces of advice. In fact, they are incredibly helpful. But here's the question I would like you to consider. Have you ever met someone who did all of those things and yet something still felt off? Technically, they were excellent. Their communication was polished. Their presentation was impressive. Their confidence appeared unshakable. And yet, their presence didn't quite land. Conversely, have you ever met someone who walked into a room, said very little, and somehow changed the entire emotional climate simply by being there? People listened differently. The room became calmer. Conversations became clearer. Trust appeared almost immediately. Nothing dramatic happened. And yet, everything changed. Why? What is it that we're actually responding to? I don't believe we're responding to technique. I believe we are responding to coherence. For years, I searched for language to describe this. And I think I've finally found it. Executive presence is not the ability to project confidence. Executive presence is the experience other people have when your inner world as a leader and your outer expression are no longer in conflict. Think about that for a moment. People don't simply hear our words. They experience our nervous system. They experience our certainty, our incongruence, our emotional regulation or dysregulation, our intentions, long before they consciously evaluate our competence. We've all experienced this. Someone says, I'm completely calm, yet everything about them communicates tension. Someone says, I trust my team, and yet they micromanage every single decision. Someone says, my door is always open, yet no one feels safe enough to walk through it. The words are coherent, the human being is not. And people feel the difference, not intellectually, biologically. This is why I believe executive presence has been misunderstood for decades. We've treated it as something we perform, when in reality, it's something we reveal. The greatest misconception in leadership development is believing executive presence can be added. I don't believe it can. I believe executive presence is an outcome, not an input. It's not the starting point. It's the consequence, the visible expression of something much deeper taking place internally. Which means if presence is an outcome, we have to ask different questions. Not, how do I appear more confident? Instead, what is preventing my natural presence from emerging? That's a very different conversation. Imagine standing in front of a beautiful lake. The water isn't reflecting the mountains, not because the mountains aren't there, but because the surface of the lake is constantly disturbed. The answer is not to paint a better reflection. The answer is to reduce the disturbance. Leadership works the same way. Most people spend their entire careers trying to improve the reflection, better communication, better posture, better influence, better executive image. And those things certainly have value. But they never address the disturbance itself. What if executive presence isn't created by adding something new? What if it's revealed by removing what has been interfering with it all along? This is why we spent an entire season exploring what seemed like unrelated topics: integration, internal architecture, decision-making, fear, intuition, embodiment. Because each one was quietly removing another layer of interference. Each episode was clearing the water until eventually presence begins to emerge naturally. Not because you learn to perform it, but because there is less distortion standing between who you truly are and what others experience when they're around you. This brings me to something I believe is the missing conversation in modern leadership development. Organizations spend billions every year teaching leaders what to do: how to communicate, how to influence, how to negotiate, how to think strategically, how to develop culture, how to deliver feedback, how to inspire teams. These are all valuable capabilities. But here's the question: who is doing all of those things? Because two leaders can say the exact same words and create completely different experiences. Two leaders can deliver identical feedback, and one creates trust while the other creates fear. Two leaders can stand on the same stage, deliver the same presentation, and leave audiences feeling entirely differently. Why? Because presence is never just about the message. It is about the messenger. And that is where our journey continues today. Because in the next part of this conversation, I would like to explore what actually creates coherence and why it may be the single greatest source of executive presence a leader can ever develop. So, if executive presence isn't something we perform, what is it? And more importantly, where does it come from? Over the past 20 years, I've had the privilege of coaching leaders from every corner of the world: CEOs, executive teams, high potential leaders, entrepreneurs. And I've noticed something fascinating. The leaders who possess extraordinary executive presence rarely think about executive presence. They aren't continuously trying to appear confident. They aren't monitoring every gesture. They aren't wondering whether they sound authoritative enough or not. They're simply present, completely present, which made me wonder, what creates that experience? And the answer I kept returning to was one word: coherence. I believe executive presence is the byproduct of coherence. Coherence between what you believe, what you feel, what you value, and what your nervous system communicates, and how you show up in the world. When those elements become aligned, presence emerges. Not because you've learned to project it, but because there is nothing left competing for your attention. Think about what happens internally when we are incongruent. When we say yes while we mean no. We speak with confidence while secretly questioning ourselves. We tell our teams to embrace change while resisting it in ourselves. We ask people to trust us while struggling to trust ourselves. We preach psychological safety while becoming defensive when challenged. Every one of those moments create friction, not just for the people around us, but for us, within us. Because maintaining an image requires energy. Protecting an identity requires energy. Managing perceptions requires energy. Performing certainty requires energy. That energy has to come from somewhere. And often, it comes at the expense of presence. Overthinking, hyper-focus on self. This is why I believe executive presence isn't built by adding confidence. It's built by reducing internal friction, conflict. Imagine your mind as an orchestra. When every instrument is playing a different piece of music, there is noise, confusion, tension. But when every instrument begins to play to the same composition, something beautiful emerges. Harmony, music. Leadership works the same way. When your thoughts, your emotions, your values, your identity, your communication, and your behavior begin playing the same song, people experience coherence. And coherence creates trust. Not because people consciously analyze it, because human beings are remarkably sensitive to congruence. We are wired for this, to pick up on inconsistencies of energy in our environment, because in the old days, we had to maintain our safety through that mechanism. Long before someone decides whether they trust your strategy, their nervous system has already begun deciding whether it trusts you. Think about the leaders you've trusted most throughout your life, throughout your career. Was it because they had the perfect words? Probably not. Was it because they never made mistakes? Certainly not. More often, it was because they felt authentic, grounded, predictable, congruent. They didn't leave you wondering which version of them you were going to meet on a particular day. They weren't performing leadership. They were expressing themselves through leadership. That's a very different experience. And this is exactly why we've spent so much time exploring integration over the past season. Because coherence cannot exist without integration. If parts of ourselves remain fragmented, those fragments continue competing for influence. One part wants to speak up, another wants to stay safe. One part wants to trust, another remembers some past betrayal. One part wants to delegate, the other fears losing control. One part wants to be authentic, another wants approval. And suddenly, what appears externally as hesitation is actually an internal negotiation. This is why two leaders can have identical capability and very different executive presence. One is internally coherent, the other is internally divided. The difference isn't competence. The difference is architecture. This brings us back to the framework we've been building together over the past episodes. Everything begins with integration. Integration reduces distortion. When distortion begins to dissolve, we start seeing ourselves more clearly. We stop reacting automatically. We become aware of the stories we've been living inside. That naturally leads us into internal architecture. Now we begin understanding why we think the way we think, why uncertainty activates us, why we seek certainty, why we overcontrol, why we overexplain, avoid conflict, struggle to trust. We stop judging ourselves and begin understanding ourselves. As internal architecture becomes more coherent, something extraordinary begins to happen. We develop inner authority as a natural emergence. We no longer need every decision validated externally. We no longer confuse approval with alignment. We become less reactive, more discerning, more grounded, more available. And when integration, internal architecture, and inner authority begin working together, there's only one possible outcome: embodiment. Not performance, complete embodiment. You no longer have to remember how a leader should behave, because leadership has become an expression of who you are. This is where executive presence finally appears. Not because you learned it, because you became someone through whom it could naturally emerge. Perhaps this is why the leaders we admire most rarely seem to be trying. They're not managing an image. They're expressing an integrated identity. They don't need to convince us they're confident. They don't need to project certainty. They don't need to dominate the room. Their coherence does the work for them. And perhaps this is why true executive presence feels so different from charisma. Charisma can attract attention. Presence creates trust. Charisma can fill a room. Presence can transform one. Charisma often depends on personality. Presence depends on coherence, which means executive presence isn't reserved for extroverts or naturally charismatic people or gifted communicators. It's available to anyone willing to do the deeper work of integration. And I think that's one of the most hopeful ideas in leadership. Because if presence isn't something we are born with, and it isn't something we fake, then it's something we can gradually uncover, one layer of interference at a time. In the final part of today's conversation, I would like to leave you with a practical exercise that may change the way you think about executive presence, probably forever. An exercise I call the congruence audit. As we come to the end of today's conversation, I would like to leave you with one final reflection. When we began this podcast, we started with executive presence. At the time, perhaps it felt like another leadership competency, another characteristic of a successful leader, something to learn, something to improve, or perhaps something to master. But after everything we've explored together, I hope you now see it differently. Executive presence was never the destination. It is the visible expression of an invisible journey, the journey through the valley, the journey of integration, the journey of recognizing your internal architecture, the journey of cultivating inner authority, the journey of becoming. Perhaps that's why executive presence has always been so difficult to define, because we were trying to describe the fruit without understanding the roots. We admired the confidence without understanding the courage required to become congruent. We admired the calm without understanding the emotional regulation beneath it. We admired the clarity without understanding the years of integration that removed distortions. We admired the influence without understanding the character that made influence trustworthy. Presence is never the beginning. Presence is the consequence. It's what naturally emerges when there is less conflict within, less proving, less protecting, less performing, more alignment, more coherence, and more truth. Over the last 10 episodes, we've traveled together through what I believe are the invisible foundations of sustainable leadership. We've explored how our past shapes our present, how survival strategies distort our perception, how fear influences our decisions, how internal frictions quietly consume our energy, how intuition emerges through integration, how leadership evolves from capability into embodiment. And today, we've returned to where we began. Only now, we're looking through different eyes. Perhaps that's the purpose of every journey, not to arrive somewhere new, but to return seeing what was always there, except with a new lens. Before we close, I would like to leave you with one final exercise. I call it the congruence audit. This week, choose one leadership situation that matters. Perhaps it's a difficult conversation, a presentation, a decision you've been postponing, a boundary you've been avoiding, or simply a meeting where you want to lead with greater presence. Before you walk into that moment, pause. Take one slow breath and ask yourself these questions. Am I trying to look confident, or do I genuinely trust myself? Am I trying to influence, or am I genuinely present with the people in front of me? Am I speaking from conviction or from a need for approval? Am I protecting an identity or expressing who I truly am? Where is there a gap between who I appear to be and who I am? Don't judge what you discover. Simply observe it, because awareness is where integration begins. And every moment you reduce the gap, your presence grows naturally. Not because you've become someone new, but because you've stopped trying to be someone you are not. I often tell my clients that leadership is an energetic experience long before it is an intellectual one. People don't simply remember what you said, they remember how they felt in your presence. They remember whether they felt safe, inspired, seen, trusted, expanded. That is the legacy of executive presence. Not commanding the room, but changing the room. Not through force, but through coherence. Not by demanding attention, but by embodying alignment. And perhaps that's what leadership has been inviting us into all along. Not a better performance, a more integrated life. Because when the leader transforms, everything around them begins to reorganize. Their decisions become clearer, their relationships become healthier, their communication becomes simpler, their teams become safer, their organizations become stronger, not because they learned another leadership technique, but because the human being behind the leadership evolved. Thank you for walking through this first season of Through the Valley with me. It's been a privilege to share this journey with you. If these conversations have changed your thinking, expanded your awareness, or helped you see leadership through a different lens, I would love to ask you one small favor. Think of a senior leader in your life, someone preparing for their next level, someone who is brilliant, capable, and perhaps quietly sensing that technical excellence is no longer enough. Someone standing on the verge of their own leadership transformation. Share this podcast with them. Because sometimes one conversation, one insight, one moment of recognition can become the beginning of an entirely different leadership journey. And if Through the Valley has become a meaningful companion on your own journey, I would be incredibly grateful if you followed the podcast and left a review. Your support helps these conversations reach more leaders who are ready to move beyond performance and into embodiment. And now, I leave you with this. Shift your psychology to shift your energy and transform your leadership.